Welcome to the Remarkable Retail Podcast, Episode 4, The Future Will Not Be Evenly Distributed. I'm Michael LeBlanc.
And I'm Steve Dennis.
Well, first of all, Steve, shout out to Canadian author William Gibson for that quote. I loved your use of that quote, both for this episode and in the chapter. And we've got a great episode ahead of us. We've got Jason Goldberg joining us to talk about Amazon and profitability and numbers. Why don't we start with, tell me about what you were thinking and how you were thinking that William Gibson quote was appropriate to retail.
There are two pieces to it. One is the first part, the future is already here. Why that's important, and I touch on this throughout much of the book, is if you're paying attention, you will notice the impacts of technology as they're starting to take hold. You will notice how customer expectations are shifting. And so there's a little bit of this idea that innovation or disruption or whatever you want to call it comes out of nowhere, but usually it's percolating for a while. And those that are really paying attention may discern the impacts of it ahead of their competition. So I think just reminding ourselves that we usually can find the future in terms of the things that are going to impact us if we look for it. The second part, but it's not evenly distributed, to me says a couple things. One, a little bit of what I just said, but the other thing is that usually, from my work, at least in retail, the impact of technology can be quite disproportionate, either because of underlying category issues. So a good example of this is e-commerce has been huge, obviously, and growing. But there are quite a few categories of retail that it hasn't affected very much. For example, grocery, right? Or though that's changing. On the other hand, things like any kind of product that could be delivered digitally, like music, CDs, games, right? The penetration in e-commerce has been very, very high for 10, 15 years, right? So this idea that, which I think is very common for folks like me, frequently to make these kind of sweeping statements, they may have truth to them, but every retailer or every supplier or what have you has to deal with their own unique situations. And oftentimes the future will hit us in very different ways in terms of the timing of it, in terms of the magnitude of it, and ultimately how it affects competition, profitability, all that good stuff.
I found this part of the book particularly dense, or should I say better, rich in terms of ideas. Like I had to reread this part of the book several times just for me to, because there's so much in it. I mean, you really are hitting the nub of an issue that has been either percolating or present, depending on your perspective, for 20 years, but is now being brought to a head from time, but also accelerated perhaps, as our friend Carboutet would say with COVID. The idea that this, whatever you're talking about, this percentage of your business that is shifting online, it's, the future is already here. The first part of that quote is not distributed equally, but again, the first part of that quote is the future is already here. It feels like the future is here. The future is advanced. We heard Sucharita a couple episodes talk about, whether it's 2 years in advance and 5 years in advance, whatever it is. So now you've got retailers who are saying, well, it used to be a small percentage of my business, and we can talk, I want to talk later about your perspectives around even understanding what percentage of business means, but now it's a big percentage of my business. And now I've got to think about it differently in terms of not just what it does, but what it means to profitability and what it means to even how I structure this organization. So talk me through that a little bit. Even how you think about customer lifetime value has changed in the digital era. And we have many contemporary examples of that.
Sure. Well, there's a few things I get into. One, which I think is largely behind us, but there was kind of a dismissive quality, I think, on the part of certain organizations and certain retailers that, well, e-commerce is only 8%, e-commerce is only 10%, e-commerce is only 12%. I thought that was a wrong way of thinking about it for a few reasons. One is nobody actually experiences the average, right? We're we're either below the average or above the average.
Well put.
So that's not a very helpful comment. Second, if you lose a few percent, well, even before that, I guess, e-commerce can be whatever percent of your business. The real question is whether or not you're losing share or not.
Right.
I worked at one retailer where e-commerce was growing quite rapidly. It was about 15% of our business when I was there. It's now close to a third. And we were capturing our fair share of the shift to online. So it was not a competitive issue for us. And frankly, a lot of retailers that complain about online, they had plenty of opportunities to try to capture a lot of that share. But probably the bigger thing is if you are losing a lot of business to e-commerce, even 1 or 2% volume loss could have a very significant profitability impact, whether you're talking about your P&L or, to your point, customer lifetime value. If you're losing the 2% of your top line, but that's actually 10% of your profits, right? That's a whole different thing. So
and if you're losing the engine for new customer acquisition, I've worked in businesses where the new customers came in from the online channel, and that you're not losing 1%, you're losing, basically the engine of new growth, right?
Right. So averages in general, I would hope most people understand, are not especially helpful. They may be pointing to some things to pay attention to, but that's not particularly helpful. The other thing about e-commerce transactional percentage is that there's a little bit of maybe inside baseball to this, but what counts as being rung up in the e-commerce channel is not always so clear how it fits into the big picture. And I think this is becoming way more important as we see so much more buy online, pick up in store, curbside pickup, and so forth. And we were talking about that off mic in terms of the different ways that even different retailers account for that. And we know, as we'll talk to Jason about in a minute, we know the huge influence of digital in general. And actually, digital media tends to influence brick and mortar sales more than is rung up in the e-commerce side of the ledger. So there's just a lot of noise, I think, in these numbers. And so getting away from the averages, really understanding the profitability dynamics, both in the short term and, to your point, how it affects long-term customer lifetime value, is hugely important. So I just really try to make the point in the chapter that we really need to dissect things much more precisely. We need to pay more attention to the trends that are maybe affecting other categories right now that might affect our category 2 or 3 years down the road, and just really stay on top of the trends.
You've come back to this theme, or we've come back to this theme, and whether it was you're losing share at Craftsman that's going to this Home Depot new idea, and you kind of see the truck coming, but you just can't seem to get out of the way of it for a whole bunch of reasons we've covered before. It feels like the discussion around e-commerce in businesses, and I've been at the table for several of these, is like the old discussion around, I'm better off cannibalizing myself than letting my competitor do it. And I guess the spanner in the works of all that is profitability. Like e-commerce it's tough to make money on. You often come back to unit economics, and sometimes you and I are baffled by some of the things we read and some of the things we do, because unit economics is so tough in this industry, right? In e-commerce.
Yeah. I mean, historically it has been, and it certainly depends a lot on as you said, the unit economics. And so that can be quite different. Working at Neiman Marcus, for example, we didn't have so much of this issue because our average order value was very high. And so it might take us $10, $12, $15 to fulfill an order. But if you're selling a $800 handbag with 50% gross margin, you've got a lot of marginal order profitability to make up for that. If you're selling $20 sweaters and they get returned 30% of the time, it's really hard to get your head around how you're going to make money. But I think it's a consideration. But I think the main thing to pay attention to really is your customer strategy and your overall profitability. Because just like, I don't know if this is the best analogy, but just like if you were all about order profitability, Home Depot probably wouldn't sell lumber because they lose money on it, and the grocery store wouldn't sell milk because they lose money on it. You really have to think about the whole, you really have to think about the whole dynamic. So I think having a compelling digital and e-commerce presence can be hugely important to your competitive positioning and your overall profitability. But certainly there are many pockets of e-commerce, if you just look at it on a transaction value, that are wildly unprofitable. And if all you're doing by enhancing your e-commerce capability as a legacy retailer is just shifting sales that might have occurred in your brick and mortar store to your online channel, that's generally not going to be accretive to profits. But you probably have to do it to take care of the customer and stay competitive.
One thing I've had a lot of discussions with retailers about is for those, and there is already this way, for those who are already doing a good e-commerce business, their minds were turning more to profitability of their e-commerce channel, because even pre-COVID, the audience was there. Like it wasn't entirely difficult to get more people coming to your website than the same time year before. Like the audience was coming. So they were turning their minds more to profitability. And I think that's just been incredibly accentuated. I also think this idea, and you mentioned it, returns, where you've got now an entire industry that as these as the numbers shift, returns go up, not down, and in some ways quite significantly when it comes to online. I mean, it could change the entire economics. So what was 1% is now 10% of your business, could affect enterprise profitability. And B, that profitability gets even more challenging when you start to factor in things like returns, which, as you said, could be 30, 40% on some commodities. Some are more comparable, but on some commodities, returns are huge and need to be managed very, very carefully.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things we've seen with these digitally native vertical brands choosing to get into stores, which is a bit ironic, right, in the scheme of they raised so much money on the idea that physical retail was going to go away. And certainly their plans have been tempered a bit by COVID, but many of them, Warby Parker, Allbirds, have just raised money.
Right?
Yeah, just raised money to open a bunch of stores. But part of the reason for that is they discovered that their growth was slowing down because there were, in fact, lots of customers that might like their brand, but they really prefer to shop in a physical store. It tends actually to be, at a certain point, lower cost to acquire customers in a physical store than paying Google, Facebook, et cetera, $100, $200 to acquire a customer online. Yeah. And returns are much lower. Typically, in my experience in apparel, accessories, and those sorts of businesses, returns from a brick and mortar store are like 3, 4, 5% as opposed to what you said, 25, 30, 35, even 40%. So I think that one of the ways to work on the profitability issue is actually for these guys to add the physical component. But really, I think the most important point I just kind of end this segment with is it's really about the total customer profitability and how you manage that across all the different touch points and channels and pieces of the retail customer experience.
Now, there's a store or a retailer in the U.S., and you'll refresh my memory, that is taking Amazon returns only. And they're seeing that as a way to drive traffic. Such an interesting approach. So,
I think you're referring to Kohl's.
Kohl's, that's
well, they're taking returns. They're also, I believe you can do order online and pick up from Amazon in their stores. But certainly it's a way, I think for Kohl's, it is a way to drive traffic and perhaps some add-on sales when you go to the store. And for Amazon, it's about getting more points of distribution and making the cost and the convenience of returns and order pickup, make that a better experience for the customer and hopefully a more economic one for them.
Well, I'm glad you brought up Amazon because it's a great segue to our guest, Jason Goldberg, a retail geek. He's really influential in our industry. He's got a podcast with a few more episodes than ours under his belt. So why don't we invite him on and have a listen? Jason Goldberg.
Well, welcome to the podcast, Jason. Both Michael and I know you pretty well. In fact, I know you were a guest on Michael's Voice of Retail podcast fairly recently. But before we jump into the questions, maybe you could just tell us a little bit about who you are and the work you do.
Yeah, thanks very much. I'm thrilled to be on this show. I felt like Michael warmed me up really well, so hopefully I'll have figured it out by now. But I'm Jason Retail Geek Goldberg. I'm the Chief Commerce Strategy Officer at the Publicis Group. So we have a bunch of different agencies that work with a bunch of different retailers and brands all across the world. So I get a really fortunate position. I get to work with a lot of the biggest retailers and brands in the world on their commerce and particularly digital commerce strategy problems.
So I think you answered my first question, which was how to pronounce Publicis. Is your
controversial? It depends on how pompous you are. If
well, then we know how I'll do it.
Exactly. Yeah. So most of our listeners might that are from America might want to say Publicis, which is perfectly fine. If you were French or you were Steve and trying to sound a little pompous, you would go Publicis.
Excellent. Well, thanks for that guidance.
Adidas,
or of course,
Adidas, whatever you want.
North of the border, up here in Canada, we would say Publicis.
Yeah,
Publicis,
and that's a weird dichotomy because I feel like Canadians are so much more friendly and men of the people So that would go non-pompous, but then you have the whole Quebec language thing in your mastery of French. So you would go Publicis. Yeah.
That's right. The official second language impacts
I don't think
you
you're allowed
again.
to call it second language. You may have just violated federal law in Canada.
All right. Well,
Co-equal language.
Well, as much fun as this is, we'd love to dive into some more retail-related issues. So one of the things that you were kind enough to set me a little bit straighter in a side communication we had, but one of the things I tackle in my book is calling out Amazon, generally speaking, for its lack of profitability, at least in its retail division. Several weeks ago on what is now my second favorite podcast, Jason and Scott Show, you did kind of a deep dive into Amazon's earnings and just in general kind of explaining how to think about their profitability. And I'm wondering if you could just reprise a little bit of that for the benefit of our listeners.
Yeah, and thanks for the opportunity to kind of disavow this common rumor. It for sure was true in the early days of Amazon that their exclusive revenue stream was retail and they were not profitable. And that was true for a number of years. Jeff Bezos was famously focused on the long ball and somehow got his investors to go along with him. But today, I think it's a big mistake to kind of think of their retail business as not profitable. And there's a couple reasons for that. A big one is people forget Amazon is half marketplace, half wholesaler. So about half the items they sell, they buy from a brand, they put it in their warehouse, they own it, they set a price, they mark it up, and they sell it to a consumer. And sort of typical retail math applies to that business. But the other half of items, and these items tend to be more expensive, are items that Amazon never owns. Amazon just takes a commission when a buyer meets a seller. Amazon's annual sales, if you look at all the goods that were sold through the platform in North America, it's probably like 360 billion in sales. 200 billion of that are marketplace sales. And what that means is Amazon had almost no cost for selling that. They didn't have any cost of goods. They didn't have any shipping costs. They didn't have any operational costs. They just took an 11% commission on introducing a buyer to a seller. So 11% profit on $200 billion is $22 billion in profit. To put it in perspective, Walmart makes 4.7% profit on its $380 billion in U.S. sales. And Walmart's the largest retailer in the history of mankind. They're the largest company in the world. They're the largest retailer in the U.S. And they net about $17.8 billion in profit a year on their North American sales. Amazon makes $22 billion just on their third-party product. And then, on top of that, Amazon sells a lot of ads to people that come to the website to go shopping, right? And these aren't people that come to the website for Amazon Web Services or any of the other, Amazon Prime Video or any of these other things. They're coming to a shopping site and they're shown an ad. And Amazon sells those ads and there's almost no cost to Amazon to deliver those ads. So the $12 billion they get for those ads every year is almost pure profit. If we say it's like 95% profit, that's another $11.4 billion in profit to the bottom line. So just on those two business units alone, retail ads and retail third-party sales, Amazon's netting $33.4 billion a year versus Walmart, which is a bigger retailer, is only netting about $17 billion a year. So it's hard to say that their retail business isn't profitable when they're twice as profitable as the biggest retailer in the world.
Well, that's a very fair point, and I hate when facts contradict a strongly held opinion I have. But
your opinion is totally right. It's just 10 years out of date.
Well, and I've been trying to play catch up for a long time here, but it's funny actually that I didn't understand that as well as I could have, because I did work for a retailer a long time ago that made quite a lot of money from its credit card business and from selling service agreements and other things. So even though the merchandising part of it wasn't especially profitable, the whole kind of ecosystem of retail actually was pretty profitable back then. So no, I think that's super interesting, because the other thing that I was getting concerned about in terms of kind of the headwinds potentially to Amazon's profitability, but certainly COVID's kind of changed the dynamic quite a bit, which we can get back to in a second. But there seemed to be this escalating fulfillment cost that Amazon was realizing, at least over the few years going into the pandemic. Do you have any concerns going forward that the cost of same-day fulfillment and some of the other kind of last-mile fulfillment pieces are going to start to dampen in their profits going forward?
Yes and no. So again, two halves of their retail business, the wholesale half and the marketplace half. On the marketplace half, they charge the seller for delivery. So either the seller delivers on their own, Amazon has nothing to do with it and incurs no cost, or if Amazon delivers the goods for the seller, which happens very often, Amazon sells that delivery service to the seller in the same way that UPS or FedEx has, right? And Amazon doesn't give us enough visibility into the unit economics of that to know for certain, but the odds are very good that Amazon is not selling those services at a loss, right? So it's probably an extra profit center for Amazon on that half of the business. But as you rightly point out, Amazon's overall logistics costs are a huge component of their expenses and one of the most rapidly growing components. And on the half of Amazon's business that's first-party sales, those delivery costs, directly erode Amazon's margin. So on the one hand, you go, man, when they went from 2-day delivery to 1-day delivery for the majority of their goods and and their delivery costs went way up, then that probably hurt their first-party margin. And I believe that is true. A couple things to bear in mind. Amazon may be thrilled to break even on their first-party sales because those third-party sales and ads are so profitable. In the same way that one of the second best retailer in the United States of America is Costco, they break even on all the goods and make money on their annual membership. So you can sort of think of that in the same way. And then adding to that fact, Amazon is increasingly delivering their own packages. So this year they're going to deliver about 66% of their own packages. So they still pay a lot to deliver those packages, but they control their costs way more than any other retailer. And they're able to scale much better than any other retailer that's dependent on UPS or FedEx or the United States Postal Service. So This holiday, for example, we kind of have Cyber Monday on top of Cyber Monday. We've been, COVID has driven all this incremental e-commerce sales, and we're kind of at Cyber Monday levels right now. If Cyber Monday is a big peak on top of that, we're going to have unprecedented e-commerce sales. UPS and FedEx have only grown their ability to deliver packages 11% this year. They're not going to be able to deliver way more packages, but Amazon that owns all their own infrastructure is going to be able to scale to deliver that. So I feel like while it's a big number, it's actually a strategic advantage, not a disadvantage for Amazon.
Well, it's interesting because, of course, layered on top of what the package folks are now calling super peak, as you said,
I like it.
Cyber Monday on Cyber Monday, one of them called it, we're preparing for super peak, is Amazon Prime Day is so late this year and is, you've had a long back to school promotional period just because school has been so disjointed. It just continued until the end of September. Now you've got mid-October Prime Day that, you're already seeing retailers respond to that. Plus it's going to jam up the packaging system. So, it's fascinating. I wanted to ask you about, and drawing from this great quote, Mark Twain quote, lies, damn lies, and statistics. Everyone seems to be and have an opinion on e-commerce penetration numbers. Sometimes it's the overall numerator denominator story. What's your version of the truth when it comes to the role of e-commerce? And the follow-up question, there's similarly wild swings and, we've gone forward X number of years and it'll stay there or it'll recede and you've got the smart money going in both directions. So I wanted to get your opinion. First of all, where do you think e-commerce really is in terms of, core retailer, and where do you think it is and is going to wind up as we move forward in the COVID era?
It's tricky, and everyone tends to have a different definition of e-commerce and a different definition of retail, right? So when everyone defines the numerator and the denominator differently, it's not surprising that we end up with a bunch of different numbers. A lot of the numbers you kind of can reconcile back to the same basic story, right? So in the United States, the U.S. Census Bureau published this monthly data set, and they try to tell you on a monthly basis what the percentage of what they call non-store sales is of retail. And so non-store sales is a little bit broader than just e-commerce. It would include like catalogs and things like that. But the overwhelming majority is e-commerce. And that number, in a typical year has kind of hovered around the like 12 to 14% e-commerce penetration, right?
Right.
So then you see an analyst publish a number and they say, no. E-commerce penetration is 17%. That's what like a Forrester or an e-marketer is likely to say. And you go, wait, why is one number 17% and one number 12%? It's because the U.S. Department of Commerce's definition of retail is very broad. It includes restaurants, right? And in total the last year...
Gasoline, I think, also includes gasoline.
Yeah, automobiles, gasoline, and restaurants, exactly. So an analyst might say, hey, you know what? No one buys food from a restaurant online, and no one buys food from a gas from a gas station online. So if we're just looking at e-commerce's penetration out of the total addressable market, historically, they would pull restaurants and gas stations out of that. Now, and that's where you get 17%. That's more controversial at the moment because you may be saying to yourself, hey, wait a minute. A lot of people are ordering food from restaurants online now, right? With DoorDash and Uber Eats and all these sorts of things. So smart people could debate that. There are other categories where you certainly could order it online, but historically the penetration was close to nil, like grocery stores, right? So everyone kind of looks at these numbers differently. If you look at categories that are routinely shopped by consumers online, you can kind of come up with a narrower definition of retail. I sometimes call that core retail. And, right now, e-commerce is probably 25% of core retail, right? So I think all of those are interesting numbers. They all kind of slightly miss the point in my mind, though, because those are sales where the person typed the credit card into the e-commerce engine. And increasingly, the most happy path is customers are using all these digital tools to decide where and what to buy, and they still give their cash to a retail point of sale system. And so that's what I would call digitally influenced sales. Forrester tries to estimate that, and they would say 38% of sales on top of e-commerce, an additional 38% of all consumer sales are digitally influenced. So if you take their definition of retail, 17% e-commerce, their definition of digitally influenced, which means you used Google Maps or Yelp or read reviews on Amazon or went to Samsung.com to read about a product feature before you bought it at Best Buy, add that 17% to 38%. And before COVID, 52% of all consumer purchase decisions were digitally influenced. There's $5 trillion of sales in the U.S. every year, so that's $2.5 trillion in sales influenced. And then in the COVID era, that number has gone wildly up. We're doing way more research, and we're much more surgically shopping for shorter visits and less decisions in the store. So probably 70% of all consumer purchase decisions are digitally influenced right now. So it's kind of, no matter what numbers you buy or what you like to follow, the front door of every shopping experience in America is a digital tool at this point, be it an app or mobile website or whatever.
No, I think that makes a ton of sense. So I'm curious, just to shift gears a little bit or maybe go back a bit to the discussion on Amazon. Where do you think they're going next? Obviously, we're starting to hear about this new Amazon grocery store, different than Whole Foods, more of a mainstream grocery. What's your perspective on strategically where Amazon's going and maybe the grocery store concept, Amazon Fresh in particular?
Yeah, well, so I think Amazon has very big aspirations. I think they would like to own 100% of the consumer's wallet, right? So they just like to get all the consumer spending. A bunch of categories are doing quite well. And when they look at discretionary spending, they're going to say, oh man, there are two categories of spending that we're not doing very well in: food and health. And those are two of the largest, and in the case of health, the most rapidly growing categories of consumer spending. So Amazon's been playing in grocery for a long time unsuccessfully. They've had this delivery service called Fresh for more than 10 years. A number of years ago, they bought a grocery chain, Whole Foods. Whole Foods is wildly successful amongst rich people that make podcasts, but it's actually not very big in the overall scheme of grocery, right? Like they
only about 400 stores, right? I mean, they're 1-2%,
and it's 2 or 3% of grocery market share. Like Walmart, Kroger, and Albertsons, the 3 biggest grocers in the U.S. together are like 43%. So Whole Foods is somewhat insignificant in that scheme of things. And so I think Amazon very much wants, and that, by the way, grocery is about 60% of discretionary consumer spend. It's about 60% of that consumer number. So Amazon wants to win that share of wallet, and they're not going to do it with Whole Foods alone. Whole Foods isn't in enough cities. They're not in the middle of the country. And, they don't carry enough products. They don't carry Cheetos or Pop-Tarts or any of the good stuff that we all want right now. And of course, they're very expensive, right? So Amazon has been doing a lot to be more appealing for grocery. They're rapidly lowering the price in Whole Foods. They've dramatically increased Whole Foods' digital experience, and they're now delivering from all the stores, which they weren't doing before COVID. And then they're rolling out at least 2 new grocery concepts that we've seen that are unrelated to Whole Foods. They have this convenience store concept called Amazon Go, and people think of it as a convenience store that might compete with 7-Eleven. I would actually argue it's not a convenience store. It's a fast serve restaurant, right? I think it competes with Pret-a-Porter and Obo Pon. It's mostly ready to eat meals. And those stores have tended to be about 2,000 square feet. Well, they now have an Amazon Go concept, which is a grocery store at about 10,000 square feet. So there are 2 of these Amazon Go grocers in both in the Washington area at the moment. That's a new grocery concept. They sell mainstream products, not just the healthy products that Whole Foods sells. And so that's one new entrant into the grocery market. And then more significantly, they've opened a new flagship grocery experience that's much bigger, that's more like a 25,000 square foot store. And that's what Steve alluded to. That's the Amazon Fresh grocery store. And so this store does not use the Go technology. It doesn't use the Just Walk Out, but it does have a much more traditional assortment that you would expect to see at a Kroger or an Albertsons. And, they're trying to reinvent that grocery experience. And I think I would expect that we're going to see that experience, like, once they kind of refine the concept and they're traditionally a fast iterator and a fast scaler. I'll bet you we see that Amazon Fresh concept scale pretty rapidly and be the tip of the spear for their grocery aspirations. And then I'm not even sure we have time on the show, but I do also think Amazon's doing a heck of a lot of interesting things in healthcare. And I'll bet you that's another battle we see play out between Amazon and Walmart in particular to sort of solve healthcare for the American consumer.
Well, we certainly could use some help there. Well, Jason, I know we're coming up against our time. This has been great. I appreciate, as always, your insights. I don't know if you have just a 30-second pronouncement on your expectations for holiday or just going into 2021. Anything you think retailers should be thinking about?
It's going to be a very tough holiday. I just wrote an article in Forbes with my sort of POV, but it's going to be very bifurcated. Grocery and home improvement are going to be, disproportionately strong, but a bunch of traditional categories, I think it's going to be really rough on the department stores. It's going to be really rough on the apparel retailers. Certainly, travel's not coming back. So I think holiday is going to have a bunch of big winners and losers. And I frankly don't expect us to kind of shake off the COVID changed behaviors until the holiday of next year. So I think we're the first 3 quarters of this year or next year are going to look a heck of a lot like the last couple of quarters have looked, which is a challenge and unfortunate.
Well, we normally like a more hopeful message, but you said bifurcate, which is, as you know, my favorite word. So I think we netted out.
I feel like I owe you some sort of royalty each time I've said it, right?
I get 5 cents, and Casey Lobaugh at Deloitte gets 5 cents. So it adds up over time.
Well, you're both really smart guys. I feel like the Deloitte engine is much better at collections than you are.
Sadly, that is true.
Listen, gentlemen, it's been a great discussion. I want to thank you, Jason, for joining Steve and I, and lots more. We can go on for an entire series or entire season. But thanks for bringing those insights. Wonderful to hear your voice again, and best of luck and stay safe.
Oh my gosh, great to talk to both of you, and congrats on the new show. Please be safe and be well, everyone.
Thanks, Jason.
A great interview. I mean, I can listen to Jason talk about, his insights are particularly honed in what I would say this kind of earthy reality of, you can see it when I'm sure when he's speaking to clients, and he just kind of opens their eyes to the reality of, as he described, some of the numbers. And as we just left off, just talking about Amazon and putting it in perspective about the ways that they do or do not make money based on how they go to market.
Well, there are few people, I think, that understand that whole world as well as Jason does. So we were very lucky to get him.
Well, and what did you think of the idea about the forecast for these percentages as you kind of start moving forward? Right back to our first episode, Sucharita talked about a couple of years in advance. And I guess your point is perhaps the most germane, and you make it in the book, and it just reminds me of it, is at some point, and Jason said this as well, the percentages don't matter anymore.
The other thing I think is really important, particularly given what we've seen in terms of the acceleration of online digital enablement, whatever you want to call it, is to bear in mind that however you count it, things like curbside pickup, buy online, pick up in store, buy online, return to store, store order fulfillment, you couldn't do those things if you didn't have a store, right? It's not as if it's pure play versus brick and mortar. It's really one thing. Now, that's not to say that physical stores going forward for many retailers won't change a lot. I think they absolutely have to. And the role
or there'll be fewer of them. I mean,
fewer of them, different kinds, et cetera. So it's not as if the role of the store has been evolving for many, many years. It's just becoming much more apparent, I think, right now. I think it's just generally more helpful for most retailers to think about it as all commerce. The customer is the channel. The lines are blurring. It's our job to figure out how to best take care of the customer, however they choose to interact with us. Don't get into the intramural warfare between our e-commerce channel and our brick and mortar channel. And ultimately, obviously, we have to figure out how to make some money and get a good return on whatever we do. But I think a lot of the metrics are often leading us in the wrong direction.
I like the way you ended that particular chapter with your mileage will vary. I mean, it's really this clear-eyed look at how each retailer needs to look at their particular industry and how they're approaching it. And in my mind, the potential for disruption. So, just getting back to something Jason said, and you and I were talking about off mic, I don't think there's a lot of room for tremendous disruption in grocery. Like it's a very efficient business, unlike, let's say, healthcare, which can be very inefficient. And perhaps there's room for companies like Amazon to really change things. I mean, you could also draw that to Warby Parker, who really disrupted in one way that eyeglass, that go to your optometrist and look at the eyeglasses, and they really disrupted that. So I think there's that room for disruption, but as you said, mileage will vary, right? You have to look at your industry and understand the role of e-commerce. Others, have yet to really been disrupted in some ways. I think of the Costco's of the world, not that they're online. I think of TJ Maxx, and, they've got a concept that is, has not been very e-com forward over the past number of years, right?
Right, which again gets back to this idea that some of the sweeping statements about retail just don't hold true when you go down to the more granular level. Now, I think that the off-price guys thought about it or thought about e-commerce in too much of a channel-centric way. I think there was an opportunity going back a few years for them to have really thought about the blurring of the lines and better digitally enabling their business, even if 97, 98% of it was going to be transacted or fulfilled from a physical store. So I think, they've done fine. I mean, one thing I've had people push back on me when I've pointed this out is they said, well, they've done pretty well even without that. Yeah, sure. But they would have been better equipped to get through this particular period. And I think we know that many of these trends, they might be slow to hit certain categories, and grocery, as you talked about, is one of those places which is not a great natural e-com sort of business if you think about it from a channel perspective, because e-commerce is really good at efficiency and search and more kind of the left brain side of it, whereas there's a good chunk of grocery which is very much about seeing the product in person, being able to tell the freshness of the produce and the fish and all those sorts of things. And in many cases, taking it home to eat that night. At least that seems to be the way I live. I realize I'm not everybody. So it's not a natural e-commerce transactional ship to your house kind of business, and the economics of that are not great.
Well, I was going to say that last part is as a grocer, there's not a lot of money in that basket, not a lot of profit built in each of those transactions. I was sitting with the CIO of a big retailer, and he jokingly said, I think we're going to try keeping the 25 cents that goes into the shopping cart because we'll double our profitability on the average basket. Which, was he said, listen, when I think of e-commerce, how do we factor in profitability? We can charge consumers to ship it, but that maybe just gets us where we were. But it gets all the way back to the beginning of our discussion around, what you need to do and how you need to think about the role of digital in your particular channel and in terms of your customer strategy, not just your retail sales strategy, right?
I mean, it's always hard to give one or two pieces of advice that's going to work for the majority of retailers.
Right.
I keep coming back to the idea of really having a good segmentation for your customers around their needs and their value and future value and so forth, getting to what you mentioned earlier about customer lifetime value, and then really mapping out the different customer journeys that those different customers go through and how they might vary depending upon the sort of products they're buying. Because I think the customer journey for heavy stuff, like I talk in the book about what Mickey Drexler called the de-schlepping of retail, which is this idea that the stuff that you have to schlep home that's heavy or bulky or whatever, that's great if Amazon or Walmart or whomever is willing to take care of that for you and not charge you very much, right?
Yep.
So that's one thing. It's another thing if you're trying to prepare Thanksgiving dinner and you want to get advice on wine and pull together a lot of fancy recipe or whatever and make sure that the produce you're buying is fresh, right? It's a very different experience. And so I think it's important to really be clear about how those different customer journeys play out, where there are friction points or points of delight. And then, of course, you have to map that or at least be mindful of the underlying profitability of delivering that. So certain things are more natural places for growth to occur and profitability to be realized. Others are way, way more challenging. And I think particularly in this pandemic world, it's quite noisy right now in terms of retailers doing things that are not tremendously economic to stay in business or to respond, and consumers being willing, obviously, to try new things either because they don't have a choice or they don't feel safe or their store's not open or whatever it might be. So it's going to take some time to really be able to understand which behavior persists and how retailers are going to invest over the long term.
Well, and retailers have been working so hard to remove friction from the transaction. It seems someday it's all about friction now. It's all about the friction that's brought on in the COVID era. Well, listen, let's leave it there. Great episode, and special thanks to our special guest, Jason Goldberg, for being our guest on this episode of the Remarkable Retail Podcast.
If you like what you heard, you can subscribe on Apple, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform. We'd appreciate it if you would rate and review, and we'd also love you to recommend the podcast to your friends and colleagues. I'm Steve Dennis. You can learn more about me on stephenpdennis.com, as well as the various places I show up on social media.
And I'm Michael LeBlanc, producer and host of the Voice of Retail podcast. You can learn more about me on www.meleblanc.co. You can find me where you find Steve online. So we're there together.
Well, have a safe week, everyone, and thanks for listening.